talking about who we wanted for speakers. James Patton, God bless him. He's on the board. He said, I think Barringer should speak because of the influence your parents had. And then we had Tony Levy lined up, and then Chris Noonan, and who's the other? Larry Montague. So I said, we got 3 already. We don't need this. And then Jim Patton. No, you guys are going to do it. So Tony Levy immediately backed down. He said, oh, we might some other time. But this is pretty much off the cusp here. We haven't like sat down and compared notes.
We don't talk to each other.
Judith lives here in Leland Grove. Danny lives in Bloomington. And then Doug lives here in Springfield. And I live in Springfield. We got involved, real quick, we got involved with the Iles Foundation back in 1968, correct me if I'm wrong. Dad bought the Elijah Iles house because he was afraid it was going to be torn down because it was in such a bad shape down there on South 5th Street. And he convinced 4 other friends to go in with him, and they all 5 bought it together. And I can't remember why, but Dad was embarrassed over the whole incident, and so he bought the other 4 out. So then Dad owned it till 72 or maybe even longer than that. But then he sold it to the Scully family, Mike Scully, because they had the finance backing to restore the house, but that just never.
Not just Scully. Not your name, her husband.
Okay, Michael, was it Michael? No,
Was it Michael? Oh, that's
no, it was a wedding gift, and it was going to be, they were going to take it. They were going to take it out east. Move the house out east is what they talked about. But that never happened. And
Didn't
then,
Dad offer it to the city for free? I think Dad offered it to the city, and they didn't take it.
yeah. Well, eventually, the city got involved and the foundation was formed, and Mike Dunbar was the head of the foundation then, and he was one of them involved in getting it moved over here, and before Dick Hart took over. But they wanted the Barringer on the board. If I remember correctly, they asked Judith, and Judith turned it down. So Judith asked 3 of us. It's like, yeah, I'm not doing nothing. I got nothing to do. What do I do? Where do I go? So I've been with this gang for quite a while. I left for a few years, and Dick Hart a while back called me and said, we'd really like to have you back on board. So God bless him. We always do these chats in honor of Dick, and he's so instrumental in getting the house moved, or getting the house open, and for the public. He really pushed it, and without him, we probably still wouldn't be open today. So we're going to take about a 15-second memory of Dick for all his hard work. He passed away last year. Okay, like I said, this is, I took a few notes.
Oh, I noticed.
I got a few notes here. 1, 2, 3, 4.
So who's the oldest? Yeah, what's the rank?
Oh,
Judith?
Judith's the oldest.
Oh, you're in. I should go first.
You should. We'll do that. We'll change it up. Judith,
1,
Danny,
2.
me, and then
Can I tell a story? It's a good question. Quick story. 6 years later, after I was born, Mom and Dad decided to have 1 more. Went to the hospital. Went to the hospital. Dad was in the room with the doctor. Was it? I can't remember who it was. But delivered 1, and they're sitting there looking at each other, thinking, "Man, she's still big." He said, "There's another one." Seriously, they didn't know it was twins. And the first call they made, I think, was to Dave Summers, our neighbor who was a contractor, and about making that room a little bit bigger upstairs. And the first thing I said was, can we give 1 away? Because we went to a wedding that Saturday night, this was Sunday. And I think later on my parents agreed with that.
It was going to be Uncle Paul, Steve Summers.
Doug and I went and visited the doctor who delivered us when we were 60, so about 6 years ago. He's passed away since he was like 93. And oh yeah, I remembered his name all these years, but right this moment, I'm like, so
Bergman, Dr. Bergman?
No,
Bergman?
Bergman. Yeah, it was Bergman. Yeah.
And Dad came home and he said, oh, and they've got great color, the babies. I said, oh, we're getting colored babies. I was all excited.
You want Judy to
You're up, Judith. Judith,
Oh, yeah.
You want her to stand?
Yeah, well, yeah. Okay.
Just so you all know, the only reason I found out about this was I read the Iles newsletter, so I hope you all read it.
Well, they asked me to do it, and I said, oh, we'll all do it, okay. Well, I didn't tell these three.
One of the things, when Dad came to Springfield, it was probably 1948, 47, he had doctors say to him, you're not really needed. We don't need a neurosurgeon in Springfield. There was none in Central Illinois, but they didn't feel that a neurosurgeon was needed. And then later, of course he stayed, he needed a place to live with Mom, and they ended up living at the Thomas's Caldwell Mansion on Chatham Road. And they have a little caretaker's cottage, and that's where they first went. And Mother said she got her hat on, her gloves, you know, she got all dressed up for tea with Mrs. Thomas because it was very important that she looked just prim and proper, and she had to be accepted by Mrs. Thomas, and that was a big deal. So they accepted him, and they lived out in the caretaker's cottage, and that's where I lived my first year of life. And then I think in 1950 they moved to the farm. And when they moved to the farm, Dad tried to get a mortgage. I think the farm was $15,000.
No, 27, I think.
27? Okay.
27.
27.
88 reform.
But anyway, he couldn't, because, you know, the banks just did not trust the neurosurgeon. And so he had to get some backing from some other doctors that, yes, he indeed will be an asset to the community. So anyway, I lived there for a while. And what's interesting, of course, after my parents died, I've been going through stuff, and I have found numerous photographs. And Dad, even before I was born, and they had moved to Springfield, was driving all over the county, taking black and white photographs of buildings, old farms, old homes, sometimes even empty lots, and on the back he would put the township it was in and designate it and try to figure out who lived there, you know, just sort of documentation. So I gave all those photos to Lincoln Library, so they have them. But I had no idea that his interest in history started, you know, in the late 1940s. Then what I remember is Sunday afternoons in the cemeteries, and I have a picture of Dad in the cemetery there. In 1963, he was doing a cemetery tour for the Sangamon County Historical Society. So he loved that. But
Was that Oak Ridge?
no, that actual cemetery, it's on the back of the picture. I'm not sure which cemetery. But we grew up across from the cemetery, and so as a child, I was always playing in there, and the neighbors would come complain because they'd see me behind the grave throwing flowers. Or sometimes picking flowers and taking them to Mom. But I've always loved cemeteries, and I to this day remember one tombstone with a black and white photograph of a husband and wife, their wedding day photo, and it was on the tombstone, and I mean it was beautiful. And tragically, somebody just chopped it off and took it. But I remember that to this day, how sad I was, because it was a beautiful tombstone with these beautiful pictures. But anyway, Sunday afternoon cemeteries. David and I guess Danny played baseball in the cemeteries, and Dad would be writing down everything that was in the cemetery. There would be pig lots, and I think times he found casket handles. But he had a passion to do that. But every once in a while, the sheriff's department would come looking for him, because back then, of course, there's no cell phones. And he was the only neurosurgeon, so they'd call Mother, and she'd say, he's somewhere. And they would go looking for him, pick him up to take him to the hospital for an emergency.
And one time they showed up, are you going to talk about, they showed up at the house with a tombstone?
No.
Yeah, that some, I don't know, perhaps kids or whatever had stolen the tombstone, or somehow the Sangamon County Sheriff's Office came about having this tombstone, and they did not know where it belonged. And so they came to the house with the tombstone in the trunk and showed Dad, and Dad, of course, was able to tell them exactly the cemetery and all their ancestors and everything else that goes with it.
Well, you mentioned that, that reminds me, somebody tried to dig up a grave across the street.
Oh, okay.
Remember that? The sheriff's office come out. Well, you got the tombstone here. The body's on this side. Whoever was digging down to get the wrong side, they were digging on the wrong side. I think they realized they were on the wrong side and quit.
So this is the farm that you were up on?
Yeah,
So,
yeah.
and where was that?
Old Salem Cemetery.
Okay, okay.
Yeah, right on the Old Salem
Yeah, it's
Road.
still active. We have plots there
And everybody's familiar with where that is, sort of on the 6 miles west of Springfield.
right now.
The old farmhouse is still there. And you're gonna talk about the log cabin?
Daniel,
Yeah,
was it Daniel?
Okay.
Yeah. But, anyway, so I have a love of cemeteries, whether we like it or not, and we were there a lot. The other thing I want to mention is he loved to write. And we have his diary starting about the age of 17. And they are a 17-year-old diaries. Girls, and I'm going to flunk out. You know, you think as a neurosurgeon he would have been really bright. He was worried about flunking out of school. High school, anyway.
He flunked history.
He did?
He flunked history.
Oh, that's fine.
He did.
But anyway, he...
Mom told me that. I feel real bad. I think history. She said, you know your father flunked
I
history.
think that's what drove him, his fear of
Oh.
not doing well.
Yeah, he, in his letters, and girls, and it's so funny to think my father was, but it was just a typical teenager, preoccupied with that. But we had these diaries starting at 17 and going, well, I still have one going to 1945, talking about Roosevelt's death, and but he would write almost the Times daily. He was a beautiful writer. And when I was going through his stuff, one of the things I found was he wrote, when people died, doctors died, or whoever, he would write these beautiful letters to the spouse or family or whatever. And, you know, nowadays we say, so sorry for your loss, we're thinking of you, and that's it. And he would write these long letters just recounting experiences and just talking about them. And I've saved the letters. I mean, they're just beautiful. And he loved to write, and he probably should have been like her. But anyway, he loved to write, and I still had those letters. And in high school, I went away to high school to Ferry Hall in Lake Forest. I was horribly homesick, but that was what I was going to do. It was my choice. But I think every night after work, he would sit at his office desk and he would write me a note and mail it the next day, because I think I probably had a letter for every day I was out there. And I also wrote letters back, and we have all the letters. I mean, we have boxes of letters. And after my mother died, I was very surprised, because she went to England when she was like 7 or 8 to be raised by her grandparents. And I thought she had severed her relationship with her grandmother, who lived all over, but eventually in New York City. And I found this round box of letters. Dear Mommy, dearest, and I'm guessing she was 9 or 10. Love, you know, X's and zeros, Winifred. And she was continually writing to her mother, and I had no idea that this box existed. And she wrote during the war, and you could see where the war was, they read letters to make sure they were okay, and you could see the stamp from the letters. And then I wrote letters constantly. I mean, I just have tons, because when I was at Ferry Hall, I was very homesick, and so I was writing to everybody I could. And I have all those tons of letters. People would write back to me, and one of my projects, early after I retired, was I went through the letters and I mailed them back to old friends back then. And I'm sure it was probably the only letters they ever wrote in their life. But I thought, they've got to have these letters. I mean, we're talking about boys, and you know, but they've got to have them. So I mailed most of them back. But anyway, we have the diaries. And Dad was very supportive of us. And I can remember I was involved in the women's movement, ERA, and all of that. And I can remember him going to Otto Kerner's funeral. And he he loved Otto Kerner. Well, we all did. He was wonderful. Even though he got Anyway, that's another story. But he went to the funeral and then he came to the rally in his three-piece suit, carrying a sign. And he would make a sign on his own, and he was so supportive of me in all my political endeavors and, you know, women's issues. And I'm sure there are times when he just didn't quite understand. He had an old privy, wood privy, you know, outdoor privy. And he was saying how, oh, this is called the chick sale. And I objected because it had the name chick. You know, I just.
But the guy that wrote the book about, his name was Chick Sale.
Oh, okay.
So it was a
I had no idea. I just objected. I think he was a little hurt. The other last thing that I thought of to mention is, well, my mother. And I think that my mother, actually, I've talked all about my father, but she deserves so much recognition because nothing my father did would ever have occurred without my mother and her support. And actually, when you see antiques in all of our homes and here,
The furniture here.
yeah, 90% of it, 95, was probably my mother's purchase. She knew her antiques. She studied antiques. She went to museums everywhere. And she loved art and her antiques. And she really was the one. And Dad would not be so gung-ho about buying something. But by
Yeah, he couldn't be bothered.
Yeah.
He's more concerned about cemeteries and old homes, but antiques.
Yeah.
But he'd be so proud when people come over.
Yeah, people would come over and Mother would hear him, you know, in the living room talking about, well, this piece, you know. But anyway, she deserves so much recognition. There was 4 of us kids, and she really held the glue, and she allowed Dad the opportunity to write and study and read and travel. And so I really, and I think that she was not alone. There are so many historians and people in general, and the reason and the things they did was the spouse support allowed them to do it, and the encouragement. And I just read in Dad's diary after they got married on their honeymoon, Mother was encouraging them to write. And he was saying, I don't know if I need to write essays or what, but he was thinking about it. But anyway, she was just such a support to him. And I think, and I have her picture back there too, I think so often we forget that sometimes nothing would have occurred without the spouse taking care of the home front.
And never once do I remember Mom and Dad arguing or victory.
No.
Never, not once. You know, I go to a friend's house now, their parents will be in a fight, you know, 3 or 4 times in the half hour I'm there. But I never remember Mom or Dad ever raising their voice. I remember Mom crying one time, and I remember asking why, and they said, you know, never mind.
Probably
So,
something you did.
probably.
Well, and everybody knows that Mom was a war bride, right? And everybody know that Dad was a surgeon in the war.
Yeah.
And plucked Mom away and brought her here.
Yeah.
And when they landed out out on the farm, one of the first questions Mom asked when they bought the farm from the Stellar family that owned the Steak and Shakes, which we always thought as kids was really neat. But how often does the bus come by?
Yeah.
Accustomed to England, the bus would come by a couple times a day, but here she had to learn to drive.
You guys should tell the story about your mom and how she met your dad, how she made that happen.
Well, he was at the hospital, he went over.
Why don't you start at the beginning, what happened to Mom as a child?
From New York. Jane, why'd you do it?
You want me to do it?
Yeah.
Real quick, Winifred, her father passed away. Mother,
She was fine.
3.
she was a young lady. Her father passed away. Her mother, a couple years later, was remarrying, and she was marrying a guy that sold movies to the movie theaters and traveled a lot, and she wanted to travel with him. So she took her to England, Winifred to England, introduced her to her late husband's parents. And while she was there, and she said, "How would you like to stay with Grandma and Grandpa?" And it was one of those things that Mom was kind of like, okay. And then she left her there, so she was raised by her grandparents up until the age she was, whatever, she married Dad or met Dad. And then, yeah, and then came back, and then Dad introduced her to her mother again. And it had been, I don't know how many years.
20 years, 20 plus.
So it's kind of interesting, but, kind of a rough life for a kid and all that. But at the time with World War II, it threw everything off. As you said, they never argued, but Dad's favorite line was those damn kids. That's why they didn't argue. Definitely one thing that they agreed on. But so, met during the war in the hospital. She was a nurse, surgeon, brought her back, took her to Emden, Illinois, where he grew up. And she basically said, we moved here, I'm going back. Emden's a town of 500, something very, very small town. And Dad kind of laughed. And then I think they went to Lincoln. She said no. And then found in Springfield. She said, okay, that's fine. Threw her on the farm, bought a farm.
This is what she told me, that when they were both working at Queen Victoria Hospital and she was a nurse there, she saw him coming and she thought he was very handsome. And she was already engaged to somebody else, right?
Yeah.
But she,
And I didn't know that till not that long ago.
Well, no, she told us late, after Dad died.
Yeah.
Oh, by the way, I was engaged before I met your father.
She made her way out into the hallway when Dad was coming.
well, she said, she set this up. She traded places with another nurse, and she took over going into the laundry, the linen closet to pretend she was straightening it, and then walk out and drop stuff in front of him. And that is how they first met. She set her cap for him, and then she dropped her engagement. And it was wartime, the rations. She made the most beautiful wedding dress. She was a wonderful seamstress too. So anyway, I just wanted to share that.
She knew Dad was coming because she said his shoes would like click. So when he's in the hospital, when he's coming down the hall, here comes Dr. Barringer.
So, they bought the farm. It was interesting. The farm, they didn't know it was a log cabin when they bought it. And after they bought it, they realized, my God, it's a log cabin. And once you go in the basement, you can see the logs up above the ceiling in the basement. So not knowing Dad, he just said, "Oh, I like it, let's buy it." So and went from there. But it was built in 1823. A gentleman from Kentucky came up. Well, Walters is the oldest house right now in Sangamon County. There were some cabins before that, of course. But it was kind of interesting, just a quick history of that. Walters came up from Kentucky with his 10 children. What was interesting, that researching it, his daughter had 4 children. At the age of 12, she got married. She started having children at the age of 14 in Kentucky. And then again, came up, and during child number 5, she passed away that same year. So I'm guessing that she probably passed away during childbirth on the 5th child. And then, of course, her husband went back to Kentucky, got him another bride and brought her back, and they had 5 more kids. That's what life was back then.
They lived in that cabin.
I lived in that cabin for a while so it was interesting. It's an interesting cabin and all of that, interesting family. And the hardships are just absolutely amazing when you look at what people had to go through back in the day.
Now, what makes you understand, the cabin's still there, it's just got drywall over it.
It's just
And we've taken the plank or the wood siding off, if you look at it, and you didn't emphasize it. The house was built June 1823, it's 200 years this month. 200 years this month. We've talked about it all about taking the siding off again to have people get over.
And that was Judith's bedroom.
Oh, yeah. And it was cold. It was cold.
And it was interesting too, because the government land office didn't open until November 1823. And so basically they were, I forget the term, squatters. They're basically squatters on the land. They did not own it. And then luckily, when November came around, I guess they got in line early and then ended up buying the property and then raising it. And it was across from the old Walters campground, which is interesting. where it's famous for Peter Cartwright and Peter, the other Peter. Peter Atkins. Atkins, whatever. So a lot of that, so a lot of revivals over there. There was an old church there across the street for me growing up. And later it closed, and I think it became a Southern Baptist church, and for African Americans.
Holy Rollers.
Holy Rollers.
You know where the New Salem Church is? That's where it moved to.
Yeah.
There on Jackson Road. So
And
I don't say Salem Church.
remember sitting out in front of the house, listening, thinking, oh my God.
Hiding in the bushes, watching.
Yeah, it's like, wow, these people are nuts. They looked it up. And I was sober back then, 5 years old, 6 years old, thinking, wow, that's absolutely amazing. And then growing up with that, but later the church it was interesting, but they tore the church down. Somebody once just recently told a story that we had a gentleman that kind of raised us, Hank Summers, lived in the neighborhood, and Hank was a road commissioner. And somebody took the timbers out of the church before they tore it down to use those in a house. Carol Frazee, a lot of people remember Carol Frazee's house, and built, her brother Lloyd did it, and took them out. And then Lloyd was told, well, do you want me to tear the church down? And they said, no, the road commission will take care of it, which was Hank Summers. And Hank was famous for a day like this. It was either the Barringer kids smoking, burn it down, or lightning struck it. A day like this.
Can of gasoline and a lighter, out of the way.
And Hank took care of it, so all of that. But he was quite a character, road commissioner, and all of that. And he just, growing up out there was amazing. The freedom that we had, and I'm not sure if it was because of Mom's background, growing up, but we had, Judy and I had so much freedom, and then once she had the twins and she was busy with them, and I would take off on a horse or bicycle in the morning, and I never heard a thing from her. She never worried about it. I would go to eat dinner at people in the neighbors' houses, and it was raised by the neighborhood. They said, well, don't, she can call your parents. Yeah, they won't care. And they didn't.
They don't ask me, they don't go on there.
But I had children, and when I took my 2 kids there every 5 minutes, if she didn't hear the tricycle on the tennis court making noise, she'd say, you better go check on the kids. I thought, you never did that for me.
We'd go down and ice skating on the pond at the back. It'd be 40 degrees out, so I remember running across the ice and it's cracking and then falling through.
And Hank Summers had a truck, and Hank, are you sure the ice is frozen, Hank? Sure, hop in the back of the truck. He'd drive over the ice. And I'm sitting there later thinking, you're in the back of the truck in the middle of the damn lake. But it's, I don't know, it was just a country living. And it was strange compared to today, the way things were back then. And it was just fun. Trying to think, when we traveled on vacations, well, it was interesting, you're talking about Mom with antiques. I hated antiques. I hated local history. Dad loved local history. Mom loved antiques. We'd take a family trip, and of course, retracing the family footsteps. And then Mom would say, kids, I'll give you a nickel for every antique shop you find. And Dad would sit there and say, I'll give you a dime to keep your mouth shut. 5 minutes out of town. Oh, there's an antique shop. No. So, but that's it. And another story I remember, there's a great story, and it was about this great Aunt Mary in North Carolina that Dad talked to. You guys might know more about this than I do. And he was researching the family history, and there was this great, her great uncle was deranged, is all it said. And all the historical documents. And Dad asked this great Aunt Mary, he said, why was he deranged? And she said, we don't talk about Uncle John. And Dad said, well, it'd be nice to know if it was for medical reasons or legal reasons. And she looked him straight in the eye and she said, we don't talk about Uncle John. And you're sitting there thinking, okay, does it run in the family? But so that's it. And it's great fun to talk about your ancestors, the famous ones, of course, the successful ones and all of that. But once you get into it, for every one successful one, there's probably 5 of it. As they say, when you have a family of 4, there's a black sheep of 1. We're still trying to figure it out.
Danny, if you can't figure out who the black sheep is, try to look in the mirror.
Go from there. But I'm trying to think of anything. Oh, and I remember they took me to Stonehenge in 1960. And it was one of the first trips back. And they tried to go back every 5 or 6 years. And I remember Stonehenge in 1960 climbing on the rocks. Playing on the rocks, pushing the rocks. Pushing them. And nobody's around, nothing. And it was like, and then I went back probably 20 years ago. And, you know, I think now they have armed guards walking around, it's all of that. And I'm thinking, wow, things have changed. But I mean, it was an eye-opener, and that's when I fell in love with fish.
When we went there later, there was no one there, just you, me, mom, and dad. That was it, nobody else around.
But I think other than that, yeah, childhood, yeah, I grew up real quick at Farmingdale, Pleasant Plains High School. I think I was in the top 50 of my class.
There were only 40 years.
55, so I think I did, yeah. But no, I just school just didn't make it. None of us went into medicine. And our grandfather was a doctor in Emden, Illinois. That's why they ended up moving there. So a fascinating life as to dad.
One time how he became a doctor, remember that story?
He was a school teacher,
Yeah.
and then met a doctor one time and said, if this idiot can be a doctor.
Yeah, he knew he is. So he can go to medical school to become a doctor, so can I.
And during the summers and went for that.
So at the age of 32, he started medical
I
school.
think his counselor, I'm not sure if it was in college or.
That was Lincoln, or at Lincoln College.
Lincoln College, his counselor was Bone, Dr. Bone.
Oh, yeah.
Robert Bone, Bone Center at ISU.
Yeah,
Was dad's school counselor.
Wonderful man.
That encouraged Dad, I think, to go into medicine, because Dad was talking about history at the time. And the story I heard.
For art, music.
Music history, and Dr. Bone said, Floyd, you can either go into medicine and make a life for your family, or you can go into history and starve.
Yeah. I know I heard a story that he was talking to him. He said, well, what would you like to do, Floyd? And he said, well, my dad's a doctor, but I really like music. Well, we're going to put you down for pre-med. Oh, okay. I really like music.
In Emden, he used to sneak in the bars and play the saxophone for the band because they loved it for free. Yeah, and his parents didn't know when he'd sneak out.
There wasn't anything to do in Emden.
Yeah.
Played the saxophone and stuff.
How many years between you and the twins?
6.
6 years.
Yeah, so, and it's a good point because I think that's part of the reason that my mother basically just said, go have fun, it's okay, we don't care, just.
Yeah, they didn't know to that very second that there were twins.
Yeah.
They didn't know it.
Yeah, and then, yeah, and I think that.
Herman was very embarrassed to tell us later.
Yeah, it was fun. And like I said, and we were pretty well raised by Hank Summers, the neighbor who was a took care of us.
We called him the mayor of Berlin.
Yeah,
The mayor of
and
Berlin.
he would drive up, there'd be a snowstorm, he'd drive up and down the road saying, don't come out, it's not safe, come out.
Everybody
Hey,
got
what
bread.
are you doing now? You know, that's just the way he was. And it was a wonderful neighborhood. My parents are so blessed and so lucky. My mom always said, I am the luckiest, did we put it on the gravestone?
I think we're going to put it on gravestone.
I'm the luckiest woman in Sangamon County. And her dad always, he admired her and always filled her up and all that. But yeah, so then like I say, didn't care for local history, didn't care for antiques. I started buying antiques, got into it, went back, got a master's in museum studies, and then ended up working in the archives of State Farm Insurance Company as a corporate archivist for 20-some years. And then historian archivist, and it was kind of fun. And I kind of look back and I think, God, maybe they did have influence on me. Good, all right.
I think our grandfather, I think it was John Paul, or great-great-grandfather, John Paul Barringer, was a physician at the University of Virginia, and highly regarded. And in fact, there was a building there with his name on it and a big oil portrait.
Paul Barringer.
Paul Barringer, is it Paul?
Dr. Paul.
Anyway, I don't know, within the last 10 years, the building has been renamed because he owned slaves. And I
More like the last 6 years. With all this, when they started
And I thought
looking.
that was so interesting. I mean, I'm not offended at all, but, or bothered by it, but it's just, you know, it comes home.
Dan, well, you mentioned about some of the family, I gotta mention Rufus.
Here we go.
Rufus was the general, he was a Confederate general, and he was captured.
A lot of Confederates in the family.
Yeah, we're all from South Carolina. And he met Lincoln shortly before Lincoln was assassinated. Because Lincoln said, when he was captured, he said, well, I'd like to meet an active living general of the Confederate Army. And he said, do you know, or he said, are you related to, was it Paul Barringer, who was in Congress? He said, I served in Congress with him. So it was his dad, Rufus's dad, and they spoke about it. And then when Lincoln was assassinated, Rufus was one of them was taken into custody until it was confirmed that he was not involved in the conspiracy. But something Dan brought to my attention, we've been doing a lot of research on family, all the way back to the 1400s in England, which is fascinating, or in Germany. Rufus, God bless him, he, before he was married, he had 2 children with a slave. And so he has 2 African-American children, and they became extremely...
Not his slave, a neighbor's slave.
Neighbor's slave.
And basically adopted the children, or didn't formally adopt them, but raised them financially and so on. And then one of them became the top businessman in North Carolina, the most successful financially, whatever, gentleman in North Carolina for years. And it was kind of interesting as to the whole situation going on. You're reading this and it's like, oh my God, this is like, wow.
Well, I kind of sat down and started thinking about it. Now, if we have African-American blood in our family, won't we get reparations? But I thought, the father of the kid, you can pay yourself. Is white, so we're going to have to pay ourselves.
Yeah, and he raised the kids and was very successful, and then later he married and yeah, he was single at the time and later married, and I don't know if he told his wives or not. I think he was married 2 or 3 times. They all deceased, passed away, but he kept in touch with them, kept supporting them.
Mom was also, and I remember when she was a little girl, she was told that we are related, she is related to Florence Nightingale. So we went to visit Florence Nightingale's home. Dad did a bunch of research, but she never found out how we were related to Florence Nightingale. So hopefully someday
But Mr. Nightingale would come visit the home, her family home. And then also the doctor for Lady Chatterley's lover, the lover, was also a patient of the neighbor who was a doctor. We really try to, whatever, because we can't say we're related to presidents, whatever. We take anything we can get.
It was always fun when Dad would say something and you just look at him and go, Dad, it didn't take a brain surgeon to figure that out.
And then when we go to cemeteries, we'd say, the reason we're here is because some of these are your patients. So I don't think you really appreciate it. Yes, it's you.
That's why you said damn kids.
I'm going to jump Mom and Dad a little, or jump subjects, Mom and Dad with Judith, see if she remembers this. We were probably freshmen in high school or so, and Mom and Dad went out of town and left you in charge. And we had a party, and we had to be, I think kids were driving, so we had to be 16. Yeah. But I remember we had to have beer. I don't remember drinking, but all I remember is we're in the living room looking out the window, and in the distance we could see red lights coming. The cops are coming. Uh-oh, somebody told the cops. So they found out. And everybody went running, hiding, and I think it was Rick Hussey and Pete Carell went up on the upstairs, and they jumped up the second story window. Pete Carell grabbed the gutter, swung his feet, kicked out the window below, landed, and then they got up and started running. Well, let me see here. If you got the house like this, the red lights are coming down the road this way. They jumped out, and there's a lane on this side of the house. Well, they're hiding in the lane and jumped the fence on the other side. All of a sudden, that car with its lights and siren going turns and goes. So they're running down the lane and thinking the cops are chasing them. And they jumped over to the bean field. That was the ambulance. It was going to the back. Had nothing to do with us. I just roared. they thought for sure, it's like, you know, all these kids there, and they know we're back here and they're chasing the two of them.
We were a little bit wild. Floyd used to talk about the night he graduated from med school, or when he was in England, he graduated something, went out and got drunk. And I mean, we're talking 2 beers.
Yeah.
He was a wimp. And it said the first time and the only time he was ever drunk. And I'm sitting there and I'm 19 years old thinking, oh my God, I can't believe this. He only knew. Sorry.
When I was 15, Kevin Wilson was my next door neighbor, my best friend, and he'd spend the night, and he was 13, he was about a year and a half younger than me. Mom and Dad didn't know. We had an MG midget that he bought after he visited England.
In England, they brought it, had it shipped out.
Oh yeah, he did. But it wasn't, the steering wheel was on the right side. But we knew where the spare key was. And so I remember Kevin and we did this, I could fit 3 different vehicles. There was station wagon once and the Skylark, but we climb out the bedroom window and then there's this, you angle up and you get up on the flat roof of the house. You walk across the flat roof to the antenna. We were now standing on top of Mom and Dad's bedroom. You know, if they're awake, they could hear they're creaking. And then real quietly, we climb down the antenna. We go out and we get the car, middle of the night, and drive to town. And I always thought, there's going to be a phone call, Dr. Barringer, this is Sheriff Campbell out here. We got your boys down here. Oh, my little angels are upstairs in bed asleep.
Or the hospital's gonna call and need Dad to go in.
Yeah. So I remember doing that on several occasions.
You did that?
No.
I didn't know that.
Well, I didn't know anybody told that. But I remember we took the Skylark and we were so impressed, we drove this on the planes to see how fast it would go. And I remember it only went 93 miles an hour. And I remember the next time we did it, we were in the old, we'll call it the station wagon, the old chuck wagon. And we did the same thing. And we were surprised, it also went 93 miles an hour. And we got that gas coming back to the ground.
Probably on V8s.
And I went on to be a policeman.
And after this, you'll understand why I never wanted to have children. Because they tormented me so badly, I thought, I cannot deal with being a mother or having children. So that was out of the picture.
We were terrible.
Oh, they were. And I got a lot of abuse. And so I never had children.
Question. Mom, Dad never let, so I got a question for Dad. We could not have a swimming pool because Dad had so many patients with diving accidents, broken necks, paralyzed from the neck down. And another thing we couldn't have, motorcycles. Because, you know, he had everything. Saturday night, I remember the phone would ring and he'd be gone all night. And then one day, guess who shows up about the home with a motorcycle? Later falls off of it, breaks his clavicle. How in the world did you get a motorcycle without getting disowned?
I told him that it wasn't mine when I was 17, and I just borrowed it from a friend, and he wasn't happy. But then he said, after I turned 18, he said, "Boy, you sure do have that motorcycle a lot." And I said, "Well, I bought it." And he called me every SOB meeting. And then 2 o'clock in the morning every night, he had a motorcycle accident, or 1 in the morning. You awake? Yes, sir. He said, "Come on, let's go." And you go in and you see these patients laying on the table. And I'm like, oh my God. And then the next morning you get on the motorcycle and take off and buzz down the road at 100 miles an hour.
He had to do a procedure one time when I went with him on a Sunday. And I'm sitting there watching this. It sure is hot in here. Why am I sweating so good? Boom! Out I went. Next thing you know, he's embarrassed. The doctor's kid laying on the floor passed out.
He used to take us to the hospital during operations and would stick us in the corner.
You want to tell that story?
With a full guard.
Doug, you want to tell that?
Yeah, we went in one evening, I think it was a weeknight because it was during school year, or a weekend, excuse me. Probably a Saturday night. It was probably about 9 o'clock. I got a call, a patient coming in from Quincy. And he didn't think it would be long, and he told Mom, he said, "I'm going to take Doug with me." And so we went in, and an elderly lady came in and ended up brain tumor, needed to do surgery. So I got to go in, scrubbed up, put on the gown, and got to go watch. And of course he needed an assistant, another doctor to assist. And he called Dr. Shatara. He may remember that name. I think Dr. Shatara was from Ashland. They called Dr. Shatara, and Dr. Shatara showed up. And Dr. Shatara
So
put
does he know about
had put me on a stool just standing over the patient, and Dr. Shatara said, "Well, why do you need me, Floyd? You've already got someone in there."
That guy, yeah, he had black hair. Then he said, well, who's that little Chinese doctor?
He said, that's my son Doug. So got to watch him do brain surgery.
Yeah, we all got to watch brain surgery.
Hoping it would rub off.
Yeah, hoping to, yeah. Of course, you wouldn't get to do that. He did now.
None of us took the bullet.
Related or unrelated, there's a friend of ours, Bobby, who I don't know if I should say names.
Yeah.
Bobby Woodruff. He used to stop and spend the night at our house, and because he lived in Pleasant Plains, and we lived, the farm's right between Plains and Springfield, so we always go to Springfield. Well, Doug ran around with Bobby sometimes, and I ran around with Bobby sometimes. Well, Doug was dating a girl, Pam, and the night I came home, and I got into bed, we had an extra bed in the bedroom. You want to tell?
Yeah, David was in bed.
Sleep.
I can't remember exactly who got home first, though. I think it was him. And then I came in a little bit later, and in the spare, Bob was sleeping in the spare bed. And so then I went to bed. And the next morning I got up and we went to church with Dad.
Yeah, Dad got us.
Mom got us up, and Mom didn't go because she couldn't have someone stay the night and not make breakfast for them the next morning or take care of them. It just wouldn't be very nice to do. And David and I are sitting in church, and I leaned over to him and I said, "So what time did you and Bob get in?" He said, "I wasn't with Bob, I thought you were with Bob." And everybody knew that we didn't lock the front door. And Bob lived in Pleasant Plains, didn't want to drive all the way to Pleasant Plains. So he did, I'm just going over to Doug Dave's.
Mom fixing breakfast. Exactly.
Yeah, we come home from church, he's sitting there eating breakfast.
Yeah.
And then he said, I'll see you guys later.
So, and that's the way it was growing up out there when, there wasn't much traffic out there. You didn't have people, it was a little lane that we lived on.
I think you're talking about your story too about you and sleeping in the chairs up by Mom and Dad's bedroom window.
Oh, had too many to drink one night and just decided to sleep outside.
Well, came home.
Came home.
I don't think Dad locked the door. Was the door locked?
I doubt it. We were just sleeping outside and I was with a buddy. And all I remember is Dad waking us up saying, "You gotta come inside. What are you doing sleeping outside?" And I, for years, thought, how did Dad know that we were sleeping outside on the cots? And then later on, Dad told the story that somebody was up throwing up all night.
Right outside their bedroom window.
That'd be Bob.
I had a similar experience. We had a little guest house. It was a smokehouse, I made it into guest house. And my boyfriend, my first boyfriend, was staying with us. And he was in the guest house. And I leave the guest house and go inside the house. Of course, the door is locked. And panic. So I spent the night in the guest house, I think, up all night, waiting for Mother to be in the kitchen. And Mother, she was cool about it. She never said anything to my dad. They were very cool. And I should say. With my boyfriend, we decided to go visit a friend in New York. We're going to drive there. And my dad came into the Sangamo room, put his hand on my leg, and he said, "Don't let the walls of Jericho fall."
Oh, right.
And I just, there was really, and I think that was why that oftentimes I would appear hippie and very wild and, just crazy, but I was not at all. And I think that it was sort of the freedom I felt with my parents, and then also the fact that I went away for 3 years and I was so homesick that I did not rebel. I did not go through that because I really appreciated my family and wanted to be home. And my first year was when we were having problems with Cuba, and I can remember thinking, oh my God, we're gonna die, and I'm gonna be up here, and I will never see my brothers grow up. You know, and that's not normal for a 16-year-old. You know, it's not normal. So anyway, that was sort of different.
They never did grow up.
But
And
anyway,
his mother was very strict, by the way.
Oh,
That was
yeah.
one thing I think he realized how strict she was.
yeah,
with
she
him.
was very religious,
And,
very strict.
Yeah, and so I think he kind of went the opposite direction.
But he really, he gave us a lot of freedom, and I think that freedom allowed us not, we didn't have the need to rebel.
If I had to do over, and I think everybody might say this, if my parents were alive today, I'd just like to talk to them for 30 seconds and just say, thank you,
Yeah.
and I'm sorry. Don't you might think I'd ever learned.
He was pretty smart. One time he came in, I think it was 6 in the morning or so, and grabbed the newspaper on the way in. Dad was leaving. And Dad was, are you just getting home? No, sir, I woke up early and decided to go get you the paper. Well, thank you.
I'd come in the door and I'd go left to go to the bedrooms, you go right to go to the laundry room. So I'd go to the laundry room, I'd take my clothes off. And so if he caught me, I'd be like, no, I was hungry, just come down to the kitchen and get something. So,
I think he knew.
I think,
The one thing I think about mom and dad was they let you learn from your own experiences. That they weren't driving us to do something as much as you learn on your own. And I think that was true of Dad. I mean, going off to England when, I don't know how old he was, still in med school, and was listening to President Roosevelt give Saturday mornings, the president would give the radio address. And Dad was in Peoria at the time. And listened to the address, and they were calling for doctors to England. And this was before we entered the war.
10,000 doctors.
10,000 doctors.
10,000 doctors.
And his father came to Peoria that day or the next day and asked, Floyd, did you listen to the address yesterday? And that sounds pretty exciting, doesn't it? And within a matter of weeks, Dad was on his way to England. So
I was listening to one of his memoirs the other day, and he said that Roosevelt asked for 10,000 doctors, and they got 60. Floyd was one of 60 nationwide that on their own volunteered.
So it was actually not a U.S. veteran, but was it Royal Medical Corps?
Yeah, something like that.
Something like that. So not a U.S. veteran, but was there before we entered the war and thereafter.
Dad, I'm going to wrap up real quick.
There's one story that I just love. Tell the one about you and Doug and the upstairs and downstairs phone and the speaker coming
Oh, that would be Irving
Oh,
Stone.
Irving Stone.
Oh, God.
Oh.
Dad was president of the
Dad was president of the Abraham Lincoln Association for 12 years. And Irving Stone, who I had no idea who that was, but he's an author, a great Lincoln scholar. But we were at church, and we were coming home from church, and he said, we have to get home, because
he was expecting a call.
expecting a call from
Stone.
Irving Stone, wanting to know if this is a black tie affair. So he wants to get home, so, kids stay off the phone, because we were always getting on the phone. The hospital would have to call and cut in, have the operator cut in, because they'd have an emergency, and we'd be talking to Susie Q on the phone. So I went to the bathroom, and it was 2 lines, and I dialed, by that point, and so I dialed the main line, and Mom, I don't know who we answered the phone. I don't know, I just said, just hand it to Dad, hand the phone to Dad. So Dad gets the phone and goes, oh, all right, I said, Dr. Barringer, this is Irving Stone. Oh, Irving Stone, so glad you called. And I said, I wanted to know if this was a black tie affair. Oh, yes. And then I just started laughing. I was in tears laughing. I was in the other room. And all of a sudden, Mom says, I'm watching your father. And all of a sudden, he just, damn kid. She didn't realize what had happened.
We were probably at that time, I don't know, maybe freshmen in high school, freshmen or sophomores. And I remember when Irving came to Springfield, Irving was very, very good friends with Coach UCLA coach. Yeah, John
Johnny
Wooden.
Wooden.
John, he was best friends with John Wooden. And so David and I talked about playing basketball, high school basketball at Pleasant Plains, and how good we were and how good the team was. And he took interest in that and asked if we would like to have him talk to Coach Wooden
Oh, God.
and have a representative, a scout, sent to watch us play. And we, of course, said by all means.
And
And
he had a summer camp. I remember I wanted to sign up to go out to the lake.
And
Summer
Dad told us later that he meant it. And that it wasn't until Dad was taking him to the plane when he was leaving, Mr. Stone, Irving Stone was leaving, that Dad told him, by no means. John Wooden said it. And I thought it would have been so neat. John Wooden Scout coming to Pleasant Plains to watch a bunch of 5'11" boys run up and down the floor. But anyway.
Floyd, I remember, one thing I remember about him was every time you walked in the front door, you looked straight ahead, and his office is straight ahead, and he's always at that typewriter, typing away, just typing away, always. And then he would want to read something. So I got this.
Corona.
What's that?
Smith Corona type.
He'd say, I want to read something to you for this presentation or whatever, and for the Abraham Lincoln Association banquet. So I wanted to talk about this. And he'd sit there and read that stuff to me, and right over my head. He wanted to know what I thought. That's good, Dad. That's all right. I never have a clue what he was talking about. And one thing that I noticed with this place, because I remember with Clayville, I remember if you remember this or not, we went to visit Clayville, and it was completely dilapidated. It was completely falling apart. It looks like it could be torn down at any moment. And
I'm surprised he didn't buy it.
well, yeah, but the next thing you know,
Emmett Pearson at that time invited him.
Yeah, it was Emmett Pearson.
okay, and then Emmett bought it. Emmett bought it and restored it and fixed it all up. And as you know, after that, the state of Illinois ended up getting a hold, or no, the college got it.
Same mistake.
Yeah, and then the state of Illinois took over, and then it was in terrible shape again. And then Mr. Boardman, or whatever, Borden was out there. But that's what I've always been afraid about with the Iles Foundation. We've talked about this, and Dick and I talked about this, about what's going to happen when the people that are interested now in saving this house, now you get the next generation that doesn't have a real tie to it, and it starts to get dilapidated again, and nobody, so it's a sad cycle. You're up, buddy. Didn't even go so long.
Oh, the other thing that Dad did was, well, of course, he did historic homes in Springfield, and he was all over, but he knew the people that lived in the Freeman Hughes house. He would visit them, and they were an old couple, and he could only get into the front room. But then I think he died, or she died, and he died, and anyway, they wanted Dad to buy the house. And he bought the house, lock, stock, and barrel, I mean, the dirty underwear, everything. And the basement, the house was like in the 1800s, and something would break or get old, it went to the basement. So the basement, and it was a dirt basement, was just filled with furniture and just top to bottom. And so they slowly restored it and tried to open it as a tea room. And it lasted for a couple of years. But when I came back to Springfield, I worked at Lincoln Library and I had to move into town. And so they said, well, why don't you live in the Freeman Hughes house? So Dan fixed up a back room and I had a bedroom upstairs. But they had that house for years. And luckily they were able to sell it to a couple that restored a lot of it. And that's on the corner of Monroe and Walnut with the gingerbread.
Oh, that beautiful house.
And yeah, it's a beautiful house. And luckily they restored it, added, air conditioning and heating and whatever. So anyway, so I lived there for a year or two. And then finally, they had to sell it. But very Victorian, very middle class.
Yeah.
And the family at one time, I think, had been worth millions. But I think the stock market, I don't know, anyway.
It was interesting because in the basement I found some boxes of old wood planes, and it was interesting. And the name, I don't like the name, but later I found out, looked the guy up. Thank God for the internet. And he was a carpenter for the Wabash Railroad. And then so these were his tools, and I thought, well, what are they doing in the basement of Freeman Hughes? And he had 3 daughters, And two of the daughters had moved out of state and lived elsewhere. One of the daughters was here. And I'm guessing that the daughter here inherited these. And I never knew her relationship with the Hughes. And then I read her obituary, and she was walking home one night from a friend's house that lived on the corner of Walnut and Monroe, the Freeman Hughes house. And then on the way home, she passed out and died. And I'm guessing that since they were such good friends and they had no children, she gave them these things, and it was just pure luck that they're all of a sudden, I'm sitting here thinking, they collected historical stuff around Springfield. All kinds of people would give them, donate things to them, and give them, they just hang on to it. Of course, because we didn't have the Historical Society Museum or anything to take care of all of that. And they took care of it and put it in their basement. And it was just pure luck that this guy, so they're probably from 1850s to 1860s, something like that. Pure luck. Neat place.
I'm going to shut up. Dad, everybody knows Dad had a love for historic homes in Springfield. He wrote a book on historic homes. Included in the book, I want to mention this before I forget, was the Leland farm, the Leland house. And at one time, Dad had interest in buying that. And decided to stay and move in a family, I guess.
Yeah, oh yeah, I went to look at it.
Did you go look at it?
Red shag carpeting in the living room.
Yeah.
I remember.
And that was probably back, maybe about the time Alan bought it, I would think back in the 70s, that Dad almost bought the Leland farm. And he had the book, The Historic Homes of Springfield, and I think it was a Saturday morning, I know it was at least me, and maybe you, and Don Craven. He dropped us off at the old State Capitol Mall with a box of these books, Historic Homes of Springfield, with the idea that these three 12-year-old boys
And a card table.
were going to sell this book for, I don't know, $1 a book or something like that. I think we sold maybe 2.
I don't think we sold that many.
Maybe we sold that.
We have one.
And now, I do. It's a valuable book. It is a valuable book. Sometimes you'll see on the internet on the Memories of Springfield, somebody will post an old home or something, an original, and it'll be a page out of Dad's book when it talks about a historic home. But this won't be in any particular order. But growing up out on the farm was wonderful. The road that ran in front, Old Salem Lane, was just a lane then. And Mom would talk about the fact that, yeah, the road was, there was no traffic. It gave us the opportunity to ride go-karts, to ride horses, to ride bicycles, and we would literally be gone all day. Mom and Dad wouldn't know where we were. We were out on bicycles, whatever, and come home that night. But when we started school, I didn't know this until a good friend told me this. When we started school out at Farmingdale, a good friend of mine's mother found out that her son was going to be going to school with a doctor's son, with a neurosurgeon's children, and that she had to make sure that he was properly attired to be going to school with a doctor's children. Well, I can tell you, my wardrobe and David's wardrobe were probably nothing more than blue jeans, a t-shirt, and tennis shoes the entire 4 years of high school. But I always got a kick out of that. When we were kids, we got to run the halls of Memorial Hospital and St. John's. And that was really neat. And every once in a while, if we run into an old timer that knows the name, there's still a lot of respect there. I played baseball though in Springfield. Rather than, I don't know, in the summertime, I don't know that Pleasant Plains had a league. So I would play baseball at Clark Griffith. And I remember that after practice or after a game, Dad was usually not there. Mom would usually drop me off, and she had no interest in baseball, and she would go home. But I would get an offer for a ride home from a parent, and I remember I would just tell the parent, no, that's okay. Mom's coming to pick me up, because my fear was I was going to get them all the way out on Old Salem Lane, and they'd get lost and they'd never find their way back. And now everybody knows where Old Salem Lane is.
I know where they are.
But back then, it was like, we better.
Remember the bus dropped us off one time, we called it the shuttle bus, when we got done with basketball practice or whatever, it was dark, and it was literally like 13 below. Well, the shuttle bus doesn't come by your house, because it's got so many kids, so it dropped us off at the old Old Salem Lane and Braverton. Right, a mile and a half from the house. Yeah, and it was cold and it was blowing. We walked halfway home before Mom pulled up. I'm so sorry, I forgot. Your kids are dead, but I forgot.
The computer age. Dad had a Smith Corona typewriter. And he did everything on the typewriter, and if he made a mistake, he would probably retype the page all over. Maybe a little whiteout or correction tape, or more than likely he'd just retype the page. And he had a Smith Corona, and then the computer age came along, and we got the bright idea to get Dad a PC, personal computer. So we got him a personal computer. And it only had one software on it. It was word processing. It was probably Word Perfect or whatever. Word Perfect. And I had it set up so that when you turn the computer on, it automatically went into Word Perfect. There was no reason for it to do anything else. And Dad just really never got the hang of it. And one night they're watching the news, and it was a story about a young boy that had hacked, and this is when the internet did exist, and this computer wasn't even hooked to a phone line. But this young boy had hacked into the Pentagon. And I don't know what the year was. It was probably in the late 70s, something like that. And Mom and Dad are watching the news. And Mom said, Floyd, you're probably hacked into the Pentagon. And the next day he gave the computer to Judith. I
don't know about the boy, but I just remember that part about somebody hacked in, and they were watching the news. Floyd, you have hacked into the Pentagon. So they gave away his computer.
To the Smith Corona, and it was just as happy as could be just being on the Smith Corona. But I don't think I really have much more to add other than it was a wonderful life to grow up.
And you don't realize it, I mean, with myself, you don't realize how good a life you have.
How fortunate we were.
Yeah, because you don't have anything to compare it to. But now I look back and say, we had a really good life.
Yeah, that was really true that each day we were on our own. We were allowed to do whatever, to go to friends, play baseball, bicycle, and
A friend of mine and I got on we got into Springfield when the bus station was on 9th Street. We jumped on a bus and went to Jacksonville. And I thought my mom and dad would be, livid if they knew at the age of 13 I'm standing at a Burger King in Jacksonville. We ate, then we walked back to the train bus station and came back to Springfield.
You were little. I remember bicycling into Steak and Shake when it was downtown on 6th Street. It was headquartered there, and of course we had that slight connection to the cellar so we could get free food and free milkshakes, and then bicycle all the way back home.
Yeah, I used to ride the horse in the town, where the old Jill Osco is, today's county market or something. And we used to Nellie Bell ride the horse in, and it was just nothing. But Dad one time took me to Jacksonville, to the state asylum, is that what it's called? And I remember, and I got a tour of it, and I remember just the hallway, seeing these people in the hall. And I always wondered why he took me there. You better watch your butt, kid. This is where you're going to end up. And I always had a feeling that he was trying to scare me off my knee. And it was something like out of the Jack Nicholson movie. Yeah.
Can you give us some dates? I mean, I
was born in 1950. He was born in 49. I was born in 1950. And so, and I probably would have been 12, 13-ish at that time. And then he traveled a lot too. And when he first, because we got his tools, his medical tools. The hospitals did not have medical tools for him. He had to take them with him. And then he'd get calls to like Effingham, which is 2 hours away or so, and have to drive down to Effingham rather than bring the patient here and then go there. But I remember when hospitals started having tools, he gave us a lot of the chrome tools, the drills and so on. Chrome, really nice. Excuse my French, but they weren't worth the crap. Because you use them on wood, and it was like, what good is this? And it was a bore to drill your skull with. And Jesus.
Well, the one tool I remember was we had a lake and we'd fish and we'd get fish. And Dad would use one of his surgical tools to
Skin.
skinned the fish, the catfish,
So.
because he didn't like it.
The hand drill I have the hand drill.
Yeah, that-
Some of his
yeah,
other
yeah.
shots.
I actually, that's what he used when I watched him do brain surgery. Because he used the
So that's,
Oh, my God.
Oops, wrong spot.
I don't know how to go into neurosurgery.
Actually, during he was in England, and there was somebody who was supposed to go into neurosurgery and got tuberculosis. So they asked Dad if he wanted to do it. And fortunately, Dad was able to study under the best international neurological surgeons in the world. And that was just very rare. And then after he finished his service in England, they let him go for like 3 months to, I think, Oxford and Manchester University and Edinburgh. And so he got to study around. So he really had an exceptional education, which was not planned by any means.
Just lucked it.
But yeah, it was just luck. And he got to, and then he studied he worked with Dr. Sweet in Boston.
Sweet,
yeah,
he
in
was
England.
from Boston and England.
Yeah, so he really had a chance to work under the best. So technically, he was top notch.
And I'm not sure if I said it to him, we were talking earlier, maybe I said this, he wanted to be a writer. Did I say that? Oh.
But I don't think
Grandfather said, no, you can be a doctor.
But-
Writing's a hobby.
Yeah, I always thought that because his dad was a doctor, and back then, you go to a patient's dying, and you just sit there with the family and the patient, and they die. Because there's very little, back in the, 20s that you can do. And Dad would go and he would sit there. And so I always felt like he knew at an early age that he was going to be a doctor. It wasn't sort of a choice. It was just that is what his experience was.
And he was extremely dedicated to his practice. She only neurosurgeon for many, many years until Lyle Waycaser, until Lyle came along. Dad was very dedicated. Dad didn't play golf. He saw that as a waste of time. It was just his history, hobby, and then his medical practice. And Mom, we did not belong. He belonged to the
Sangamo Club.
Sangamo Club, because they would get together about once a month. They had a club called the Cracker Barrel Club, and people would get together, and it was really just to talk about history. And they would pick a topic, and someone in the group would do research on that topic, and then the following month would present a paper, and they would sit around and argue and debate that topic. So he loved that, he belonged there, but we never belonged to a Illini Country Club. And once in a while, my understanding is that Mom would say, Floyd, shouldn't we belong to a Illini Country Club? And Dad would say something to the effect of, with all due respect, I put up with a lot of those individuals all week. He was more comfortable in a cemetery or an old home.
so was your dad recruited to Springfield, or is it because the family was nearby?
I think it was just nearby.
It was nearby, but it was bigger. And he thought about being a neurosurgeon in Lincoln. That's a neurosurgeon in Lincoln.
I think it was just a.
Yeah, and I think
Wait, go ahead.
I'm told that my grandpa, who was in New Holland, which would have been close to ended.
Oh, yeah.
1950, he had a brain tumor, and that your dad was called up to Lincoln to see if he could help him. Didn't turn out that way, but so I've known your Barringer name for a long time.
And once in a while, the name comes up, and
Yeah.
now it's becoming more and more old timers will recognize that name. And my son, when he was about 10 years old, so this has been about 27 years ago, was playing Little League Baseball, and we were in Taylorville. And it was a regionals, and so they have a microphone, and my son comes in to pitch. And the announcer said, now coming in to pitch, Justin Barringer. And a gentleman, an older gentleman, stood up in the front row and turned around because we were sitting, our side was kind of the first base side, and said, does anyone know if that boy is related to Dr. Floyd Barringer? I said, yeah, that's his grandson.
Yes.
And also his brother Donald, Dr. Don, was an OB-GYN in Lincoln for years. His only brother. And then practiced there in Lincoln, and later worked in ER.
And then Mary is his wife, Mary Barringer. A lot of you know her.
I remember.
You want to tell the story too, Doug, of, oh God, what is her name? I won't tell him.
Well, Dad is obviously very involved in history in the old state capitol. He was a big supporter of that, and Wally Henderson and the Capitol. And Dad at the time was very involved with the reconstruction of the old state Capitol. And then when that was signed in to become part of the federal park district, is that
You're about Lincoln Home.
The Lincoln Home. And they did the signing, Nixon was here and did the signing at the old state Capitol.
Right.
And so we've got a picture, Paul Finley introduced Dad to President Nixon.
Along that line, I'm not doing it like I used to. I'll get online and eBay, and I live in Springfield, Illinois, and I'm looking up and I see pictures of Nixon's visit to Springfield 1971, and this is when he signed it, making it a federal property, and Dad was president of the Abraham Lincoln Association at that time. So they were selling these negatives with these pictures, so I'm going through them, and all of a sudden there is a picture of Richard Nixon shaking hands with my dad, and of course I immediately bought them. Yeah. But then I started thinking later, what's the chances that you get on eBay and you find a picture of your father shaking hands with the president of the United States? Live by a flute.
Yeah, go ahead, Judith. Oh, no, I was gonna say, we should cut it off. Go ahead.
Well, war tragically is very responsible for the advancement of surgery. I mean, so much of what doctors learn, about how to do surgery and save people's lives or make an attempt was war. I mean, you just had a lot of casualties. You had a lot of practice.
Sure.
A lot of practice. So we kind of learned what worked and what didn't work. But what I'm fascinated by in your stories is your accessibility to the hospital. The idea that you were able to scrub and be in surgery with your father. I mean, now, sometimes as a patient, you're like, you feel like you have to ask permission to go into the room. And then you said we had such freedom to be in the hallways, and I mean, I see like kids taking to work at a hospital in a way I didn't imagine.
I remember riding on Dad's shoulders, so I had to be about 3. But I remember thinking I might hit my head, and I was up on his shoulders, and he carried me on his shoulders as we were walking the halls.